At some point in the last 50,000 years, you won the most consequential lottery in the history of life on Earth. Not because you were the smartest species walking the planet, not because you were the strongest or the fastest or the most numerous. You won because every other version of human that existed alongside you quietly disappeared. And the question of what happened to them is one of the most haunting, unresolved, and deeply personal mysteries in all of science. Because they were not animals, they were people. They built shelters. They buried their dead. They cared for their injured. They made tools with a precision that took researchers decades to fully appreciate. And for hundreds of thousands of years, several of these human species walked the same landscapes, hunted the same animals, and sheltered from the same storms as your direct ancestors. Then, one by one, they were gone. The species most people know as Neanderthals. They lived across Europe and Western Asia for roughly 400,000 years before disappearing around 40,000 years ago. Paleoanthropologist João Zilhão spent much of his career arguing against significant resistance that Neanderthals were far more cognitively sophisticated than the brutish stereotype suggested. His analysis of sites in Spain revealed that Neanderthals were using pigments, perforating shells, and creating personal ornaments tens of thousands of years before modern humans arrived in Europe. They were, by any reasonable definition, symbolic thinkers. They had something like culture. And then there was Homo heidelbergensis, the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and your own species, who inhabited Africa, Europe, and possibly Asia from roughly 700,000 years ago. Denisovans, known almost entirely from a finger bone, a few teeth, and a jaw fragment found in Siberia and Tibet, turned out upon genetic analysis to represent an entirely separate human lineage that ranged across vast stretches of Asia. Homo naledi, discovered in a South African cave system in 2013 and described by paleoanthropologist Lee Berger and his team, had brains roughly a third the size of yours but showed behaviors, deliberate placement of the dead in deep, hard-to-reach caves that look startlingly intentional. Homo floresiensis, a tiny hominin standing roughly 1 meter tall, survived on the Indonesian island of Flores until perhaps 50,000 years ago, overlapping directly with the expansion of your own species across that region. At least 6 distinct human species shared this planet with Homo sapiens within the last 300,000 years, perhaps more as new discoveries continue to complicate the picture. The question of what happened to all of them does not have a clean answer. It may never have one. But the evidence points toward a story that is both more complex and more uncomfortable than most people expect. The oldest explanation was replacement. The idea that modern humans simply outcompeted everyone else, moved into new territories, took the resources, and left the other species with nothing. This view was clean and satisfying and probably partially true. Your ancestors were doing something that gave them an edge. The leading candidate is language, not communication, which Neanderthals almost certainly had. The FOXP2 gene, associated with the fine motor control needed for speech, appears in Neanderthal DNA. But perhaps the particular structure of human language, its recursion, its ability to talk about things that don't exist yet, to plan, to tell stories, to coordinate large groups of strangers around shared abstract ideas. If your ancestors could say, "Meet at the river at dawn and we'll drive the herd toward the cliff," and no one else could, that gap in coordination alone could shift the competitive balance over generations. But replacement alone doesn't explain the genetics. Because when scientists sequenced the Neanderthal genome, a project led by geneticist Svante Pääbo, who received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for this work, they found something that changed the entire story. If you are of non-African descent, roughly 1 to 4% of your DNA is Neanderthal. If you have ancestry from parts of Asia, up to 6% of your genome may come from Denisovans. These are not trace contamination errors. They are the signature of interbreeding. Your ancestors did not simply replace these other humans. They met them, lived alongside them in some form, between your species and theirs was not as sharp as a textbook would suggest. Some of what made Neanderthals Neanderthal is still inside you. Certain immune system genes you carry today which help your body recognize and fight pathogens were inherited from Neanderthals who had spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to the European landscape. Some of the variants in your genome associated with responses to cold climates and ultraviolet light came from Denisovans. You are not purely anything. You are a palimpsest, a document written over, with older writing still showing through. The blending complicates the extinction. If interbreeding was happening, then the line between extinction and absorption becomes genuinely unclear. Were Neanderthals wiped out, or were they gradually folded into the expanding modern human population until they ceased to exist as a distinct group, their descendants walking around in your body today? Geneticist Graham Coop and others have noted that the low level of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans, relative to what you'd expect from frequent interbreeding, suggests the encounters were relatively rare and that most offspring from such pairings either didn't survive or didn't reproduce successfully over the long term. The blending happened, but it was limited. Climate also played a role. The period from 60 to 30,000 years ago was one of extreme climatic instability in Europe and Asia. Temperature swings, glacial advances, and shrinking habitats would have put enormous pressure on all populations, but smaller ones, already compressed into shrinking refugia, would have felt it catastrophically. Neanderthal populations were never large to begin with. Genetic analysis suggests they lived in small, isolated groups with limited diversity. A series of bad winters, a disease, a dry decade. Any of these, compounded across generations, could push a small population past the point of recovery. And disease may have been a vector your ancestors didn't even know they were carrying. When two populations that have been separated for hundreds of thousands of years come into contact, the one that has been isolated longer is typically more vulnerable to the pathogens the other carries. Modern humans expanding out of Africa had been exposed to a different suite of diseases. Their immune systems had a different preparation. The Neanderthals and Denisovans they encountered had no such preparation. This has been called the shadow of disease, invisible, unintentional, devastating. What is perhaps most striking is not how different these other humans were from you, it is how similar they were. The Neanderthal who placed a sprig of flowers beside a body in a cave 60,000 years ago, if that interpretation holds and it remains debated, was doing something that looks like grief. The Denisovan girl, reconstructed from a fragment of bone in a Siberian cave, whose genome reveals she had dark hair and dark eyes, and whose people ranged from the cold Altai Mountains to the humid lowlands of Southeast Asia, was part of a lineage so successful it shaped the genomes of modern populations across an enormous stretch of the planet. They were not failures. They were not lesser versions of you, waiting to be replaced by something better. They were human in every meaningful sense of the word, living full lives in the landscapes they knew, for timescales that dwarf everything your civilization has ever built. And they are gone, not into thin air entirely. Some of them are gone into you. But as living peoples, as cultures, as ways of being human that will never exist again, they are gone. So when you look in the mirror, you are looking at the sole survivor of what was once a populated genus, the last human standing. And written quietly into the genome behind your eyes is the faint trace of everyone you outlasted.